Homo sapiens has been around for at least 300,000 years, but exactly where on the African continent our species originated has not been known. According to some theories, Homo sapiens evolved in Eastern Africa and only spread southwards around 50,000 years ago. A new study by researchers at Uppsala University in Sweden and the University of Johannesburg in South Africa shows that this assumption is wrong. This is a direct quote written by the scientists themselves. The problem the study raises is that modern humans could not have evolved in the adjacent East African region with a lineage as divergent as the Southern African branch with no interbreeding. For more than 30 years, the out-of-Africa theory buried the Khoisan, pushing the world's most ancient surviving human lineage into a conceptual basement where their deep history could not threaten the simplicity of the dominant narrative. Despite their extraordinary genetic diversity, despite their unusual adaptations, despite their long recognized antiquity, the Khoisan were treated not as a central chapter of human evolution, but as a footnote, a curiosity, a living outlier whose existence had to be explained away rather than embraced. The theory required a clean story, a single African population giving rise to all modern humans. The Khoisan, with their vast divergence, their unique variants, and their unmistakable signal of long isolation, did not fit. So instead of revising the theory, many researchers revised the Khoisan. They were portrayed as a small marginal people pushed southward by later migrations, as if they were simply a stray twig on a tree whose trunk stood firmly in East Africa. Their deep split times were downplayed. Their differences were attributed to drift. Their ancient lineages were reinterpreted as innocuous background noise. Anything was preferable to admitting that the entire human story might be more complicated than the tidy, political comfort of a single origin model. But history has a way of resurfacing what theories attempt to hide. The new Southern African genomes, stretching back more than 10,000 years and capturing the remnants of a population that diverged nearly 300,000 years ago, have brought the truth crashing back into view. The Khoisan were never an evolutionary afterthought. They were never a minor branch. They are one of the oldest, deepest, longest isolated human lineages on Earth, and their history has the power to rewrite the story not just of Africa, but of the entire human species. The out-of-Africa model, or more precisely the out-of-British colonial East Africa model, tried to bury them because acknowledging their full significance would have forced a reckoning with the reality that Africa was never a single cradle of humanity. It was a mosaic of ancient, semi-independent populations whose divergences reached so far back in time that the very concept of a unified Homo sapiens collapses under scrutiny. Now, after decades of being dismissed and minimized, the Khoisan are finally being recognized, not as an inconvenient exception to the rule, but as the key to understanding how profoundly wrong the dominant narratives have been. The attempt to bury the Khoisan has failed. The theory that buried them is now cracking under its own weight. The oldest divergence in our species is finally being recognized for what it is, not an inconvenient exception, but the key that unlocks a far more complex, far more ancient, and far more geographically expansive story of human origins than out of Africa ever allowed. The new ancient genome study from Southern Africa has triggered a tectonic shift in human origins research, a shift so profound that its implications extend far beyond genetics. For decades, the out-of-Africa theory has rested on the assumption that Africa housed a single or largely interconnected population from which all modern humans evolved. The Pan-African variant of this model added a degree of complexity, imagining a continent-wide network of semi-connected groups exchanging genes for hundreds of thousands of years. But the new data do not support either vision. Instead, they reveal a continent fractured into long, isolated populations, each with its own evolutionary trajectory, unique adaptations, and ancient divergences. Among these, two lineages stand out as especially disruptive to the orthodox narrative. The Khoisan, whose ancestors remained isolated for at least 100,000 years, and the Mbuti, whose genomes contain ancestry from a population older than Homo sapiens itself. Together, these lineages do not merely complicate out of Africa, they undermine it at its conceptual core, pointing instead to a far older, deeper, and more geographically complex human story involving migrations into Africa, not just out of it. The Khoisan case alone is enough to unseat both the Pan-African and out-of-Africa models. The nature study reveals that the ancient southern African lineage, ancestral to only part of the present-day Khoisan, diverged from all other human populations around 300,000 years ago and then remained in an extraordinary state of isolation for years. This is not mild genetic structure. This is not a temporary geographic separation. This is the kind of long-term reproductive isolation that in any other continent would be regarded as near speciation. For that entire period, the southern African lineage evolved its own suite of adaptations, some relating to ultraviolet radiation, some to metabolism and immune function, and some to neural development, that are not shared by East Africans, West Africans, or Eurasians. Such a prolonged independent evolution is inconsistent with any theory that relies on one unified African population slowly accumulating the traits that define our species. It is equally inconsistent with any model that imagines free-flowing gene exchange across Africa. Instead, what emerges is a picture of deep regionalism, ancient humans living in fragmented pockets across the continent, often isolated for tens of thousands of years. The southern African lineage discovered in this study is not the ancestor of Europeans, not the ancestor of Asians, and not even the main ancestor of later southern Africans after 1,400 years ago. It is an evolutionary silo. If out of Africa imagines a tree with a single African trunk branching into Eurasians, this new evidence shows a forest of separate trunks, each with its own history. And in no evolutionary model does a forest become a single tree. But the new study's most devastating implication is its timing. The southern African divergence is estimated at around 300,000 years ago, precisely the age often claimed for the earliest modern human fossils. If this lineage was already separate, already accumulating its own adaptations, already sealed off from the rest of Africa, then there never was a single moment when Homo sapiens emerged as a unified species. Instead, Africa housed multiple contemporaneous human lineages, all evolving independently, occasionally exchanging genes, and none of them serving as the single cradle population out of Africa requires. This conclusion becomes even stronger when the Mbuti of Central Africa are added to the picture. The Mbuti do not descend from the same deep lineage as the Khoisan, and show no special relationship to the ancient southern Africans sequenced in the new study. Instead, they belong to a different and equally ancient branch of humanity. Even more astonishing, their genomes harbour signals of introgression from a population older than Homo sapiens, a population that had diverged from the ancestors of modern humans perhaps 300,000 to 500,000 years ago. This ghost lineage contributed as much or more to the Mbuti as Neanderthals contributed to Europeans. It existed within Africa, yet was not ancestral to other Africans. It contributed genetic material that persists today, yet left no clear fossil identity. The Mbuti therefore represent a branch of the human story that is not only divergent, but also infused with ancestry from a lineage that the classic out-of-Africa model does not acknowledge. When both the Khoisan and Mbuti are considered together, the collapse of out-of-Africa becomes unavoidable. The theory requires that all modern humans descend from a single African population that lived around 60,000 to 100,000 years ago. But the Mbuti, like the Khoisan, diverged from other human groups long before this, and the ancient ancestry they carry did not contribute to the supposed out-of-Africa migrants. These two lineages represent deep divergences within Africa that predate the very population out-of-Africa designates as the source of all non-Africans. Thus, the out-of-Africa population could not have been the human population. It was merely one of several. Worse still for the theory, neither the Khoisan nor the Mbuti show genetic continuity with the population that supposedly left Africa. In other words, out-of-Africa does not describe the origin of modern humans. At best, it describes the migration history of one African subgroup. The Pan-African model fares no better. It attempts to salvage out of Africa by proposing that Africa housed a dynamic network of semi-connected populations, among whom genes flowed rapidly enough to maintain a shared evolutionary trajectory. But the evidence from both the Khoisan and Mbuti contradicts this idea. The deep isolation of the Khoisan lineage for 100,000 years is incompatible with a continent-wide network of connectivity. The unique adaptations in pigmentation, UV response, metabolism and neural biology found in their genomes could never have arisen under the conditions the Pan-African model requires. Similarly, the Mbuti's ancient ancestry would have been diluted or erased entirely if Africa had been a continuous genomic landscape. Instead, such ancestry persists only because the ancestors of the Mbuti lived in long-term isolation, precisely the opposite of what the Pan-African model demands. These two lineages therefore point to a different overarching story. Africa was not the birthplace of modern humans, but one region among many in a wider evolutionary landscape stretching into Southwest Asia and possibly beyond. Human evolution did not proceed as a funnel, but as a web, a network of diverging and converging lineages. In this framework, into Africa migrations become not anomalies, but necessities. If the Khoisan diverged around 300,000 years ago, they may represent a lineage that entered southern Africa already distinct. Likewise, the ancient ancestry in the Mbuti may reflect a population that originated outside Central Africa and moved inward. This possibility is strengthened by the fact that fossil and genetic evidence increasingly shows that modern traits appear early in North Africa, the Levant, and West Asia, exactly the regions that could have fed these into Africa movements. The genetic structure revealed in the study is therefore less consistent with Africa as origin and more consistent with Africa as hub, one of several regions where human lineages interacted, evolved, and sometimes merged. Under this model, the ancestors of Eurasians left from one African branch, while other African populations, like the Khoisan and Mbuti, descended from lineages that had long independent histories. Some of these histories may trace back to populations that were themselves the products of earlier migrations. Africa was not the start of the story, but a crossroads in the middle. Even Charles Darwin, who was often ahead of his time, sensed that Africa housed complex and ancient human diversity, though he misinterpreted the evidence. What he did not understand, and what modern genetics now reveals, is that the unique traits of the Khoisan likely emerged in long isolated populations undergoing their own adaptive pressures. Darwin stumbled upon the clue that African groups were not just culturally distinct, but biologically ancient and deeply divergent. Today, the genetic data vindicate that intuition, even if Darwin lacked the framework to understand it. The implications of the new genomic study are therefore profound. Human origins cannot be explained by one place, one population, or one expansion. The Pan-African model fails because it imagines a degree of connectivity that simply did not exist. The classic out-of-Africa model fails because it assigns undue ancestral status to one African subgroup, while ignoring the existence of others that are equally ancient. The Mbuti demonstrate that ancient populations lived within Africa long after the supposed emergence of Homo sapiens. The Khoisan demonstrate that modern humans did not evolve as a single cohesive species, but as a patchwork of isolated lineages. And both lineages together reveal that Africa's human diversity cannot be understood without acknowledging the movement of populations, not just out of Africa, but into it. However, one of the most damaging methodological errors in modern human genetics has been the routine use of the Mbuti, along with other Central African forager groups, as a baseline African population in genome trees. For more than 20 years, genome studies have used the Mbuti as a proxy for unadmixed, ancestral or early diverging Homo sapiens, assuming that their geographic isolation in the Congo basin made them ideal representatives of deep African ancestry. This assumption was logical only if one accepted the out-of-Africa model in advance. Under that model, the earliest humans were expected to be southern or Central Africans, living in small foraging groups, with minimal influx from later Eurasian or Saharan expansions. But the new genetic findings show that this assumption was catastrophically wrong. The Mbuti are not a baseline population. They are not a representative branch of early Homo sapiens. They are not an unadmixed remnant of the population that gave rise to Eurasians. Instead, they are a product of extraordinarily complex, ancient and regionally unique population history, including introgression from a lineage older than Homo sapiens itself. Using them as a reference point has therefore distorted the shape of every tree built upon that assumption. The core problem is that the Mbuti do not occupy an ancestral position in human genetic diversity. They occupy a side branch, and a very unusual one at that. Their genomes contain signatures of admixture with an African population that split off from the rest of the human family hundreds of thousands of years before the lineages leading to Eurasians or other Africans differentiated. This contribution is not trivial. In some models, it accounts for as much as 19% of their genome. Treating the Mbuti as pure Homo sapiens is equivalent to treating Neanderthals as modern Europeans. It creates genome trees in which deep ancient segments are misread as evidence for ancient Homo sapiens structure, or worse, as indicators that other African populations are somehow derived relative to the Mbuti. In reality, the Mbuti's distinctiveness is not ancestral, it is composite, the result of repeated episodes of isolation, archaic admixture and secondary contact. They are not a window into the origin of our species. They are a testimony to how many lineages once coexisted inside Africa without belonging to the same evolutionary stream. Another major issue is that the Mbuti have undergone substantial bottlenecks and prolonged isolation, which inflate measures of genetic drift and exaggerate their apparent divergence from other populations. When geneticists use drifted or bottlenecked groups as calibration points, the resulting phylogenies can give the illusion of an extremely ancient split, even when the true separation dates are a mixture of drift, introgression, and demographic contraction. This effect has repeatedly misled researchers into interpreting the Mbuti as deeply branching, when in fact they represent a highly drifted, very ancient population, not an ancestral one. Every tree that placed the Mbuti at the base of human diversity accidentally turned their drift and archaic admixture into the appearance of antiquity. The result was a massively distorted representation of African population history. Even worse, the Mbuti were often used to polarize alleles, that is, to determine which genetic variants were ancestral and which were derived. But if the Mbuti carry archaic segments from a lineage that diverged before the ancestors of modern humans, then any allele drawn from that archaic segment is not informative about Homo sapiens ancestry at all. It is informative about a different species or subspecies. The use of the Mbuti in this context has therefore resulted in widespread misclassification of archaic alleles as ancestral Homo sapiens alleles. This mistake has undermined dozens of studies that attempted to reconstruct the timeline of Homo sapiens evolution based on allele frequencies. Instead of clarifying the picture, the Mbuti-based reconstructions muddied it, making African population history appear more mysterious and more ancient than it truly was. Finally, because the Mbuti were treated as the root of human phylogenies, every other African population and every non-African population was forcibly interpreted relative to them. This created an artificial narrative in which non-Africans appeared to descend from a branch that split off after the divergence between Mbuti and other Africans. But the new evidence shows that the Mbuti are not a root. They are one of several deep African branches, each with its own contributions. The Khoisan represent another such branch. Some West African groups may carry ghost ancestry from a third ancient population. If one chooses any of these groups as the root, one generates a distorted tree. The only correct approach is to recognize that there is no single African root population, only a network of diverging and converging lineages, none of which can serve as the universal ancestor of all humans. In short, using the Mbuti as a reference population was not a neutral choice. It baked a false assumption into the foundation of human evolutionary genetics. It forced every analysis to orbit around a lineage that is neither ancestral nor typical. The result was a generation of models that overstated African unity, understated Eurasian contributions to African diversity, and obscured the reality that Africa itself was a destination for migrations, not just a point of origin. Now that the true genetic complexity of the Mbuti and Khoisan has been revealed, it is clear that no single African group can be used as an evolutionary baseline. The field must abandon this practice and rebuild its models from the ground up, this time without assuming in advance that Africa contained the ancestral human population from which all others arose. In the end, the story of human origins is not a river flowing outward from Africa. It is a braided delta, branches dividing, merging, disappearing and reappearing across continents. The Khoisan and Mbuti are reminders of this forgotten complexity. Their genomes preserve traces of worlds older, stranger, and far more diverse than anything in the textbook version of human evolution. They show that Africa was not the cradle of humanity, but one of humanity's many ancient homes, shaped not only by internal evolution, but by waves of migration whose echoes survive in the deepest roots of our DNA. Thanks for watching.